Okay, ready to go. Welcome everybody, and welcome to all of you who are watching on YouTube or who will be watching on YouTube. Bill Lode is my name. I'm a retired professor of New Testament from Murdoch University, and I'm a Uniting Church minister. And we're looking at Mark. That's what we first set up, following Mark and looking for Jesus, engaging the first gospel. And one of the creative things about the second gospel, the gospel according to Mark, is it's our earliest gospel, and it gives us a lot about Jesus, and we can use it as a significant source. And we're going to be talking about the latter part of Mark's gospel tonight. And I've entitled this Getting Entangled in Politics, because whether he wanted it or not, what Jesus was doing had political implications, at least from the view of the politicians, and it brought about danger and death, and it was an example of resistance. So we're going to be looking at Mark on Jesus' last days. I was reflecting earlier this evening that we do something strange. We read something, we read the Gospels and we read the Bible out aloud in church. Do we do that anywhere else? We don't really, but it's a very ancient practice. In the ancient world, you didn't write things for somebody to sit down and read. You wrote things so that things would be read out loud. And that was the pattern in the ancient world. And we don't realize it, but the church has continued that pattern. So it's really interesting that we do that. We're quite peculiar, but we don't feel peculiar at all. We have public readings. Of course, they used to have public readings of Charles Dickens and others in the 19th century when people didn't have iPads or didn't have books. But we're going to be looking at the last chapters of Mark's Gospel. And you will remember that the first session we did was really about Jesus coming within movements that were seeking change, John the Baptist and others, some of them by military means, and Jesus really by means of word and deed, reaching out to bring good news of liberation. Understanding it within demonology, that's how they understood it, over helping to free people from the powers that were oppressing them. And Jesus was taking this vision of change and good news for the poor into the land. A dangerous thing to do, of course, for those who had a vested interest in keeping the poor poor. And then when we get to Mark 5-8, we saw that Mark's creativity, because Mark was doing what ancient biographers did who wanted to bring significance of a famous person. So he would use creativity, and there's a base of Jesus material, but it's overlaid by Mark's composition. And we saw that he has this wonderful pattern of the healing of the Gerasene demoniac, who's a Gentile, and then right next to it, the healing of the woman and the girl. And then also the feeding of the 5,000 Jews, the feeding of the 4,000 Gentiles. This is just typical of Mark's clever way of putting things together. And then last week we looked at the fact that Mark presents Jesus as a very un-Messianic Messiah. And the disciples were obsessed with normality, really. If you're going to be a Messiah, you're going to be victorious, you're going to win. And Jesus was presenting the opposite. He was going to be vulnerable. And this really didn't make sense to them. And Mark plays up the image of the disciples as being really thick. And he does that not really because it's history. He does it because he wants to challenge the people of his own day, disciples and followers, not to be thick, but to see and to understand and to act appropriately. And then chapters 11-16 are about Jesus being rejected and finally vindicated. And we're going to look at those. And Mark has also used all his rhetorical skills to put this together, and he's used all kinds of techniques, but it's an overlay, and underneath it we can actually find something of real history. So, Messianic hopes for a Messiah, and remember, a Messiah, it's the same as the Hebrew word, the Greek word is Christos, Christ, it's the same. It's the hope that there would be a leader like King David, of David's line, so often talked about as the son of David, and often pictured as the one who, when God's kingdom, when God's reign is established, God's empire is established instead of the Roman Empire, the Messiah would be the one who would lead. So he would be the ruler under God in God's kingdom, a king like David. The other thing that was a very standard element was that the Messiah would reform or refurbish or renew the temple. And we think that Herod the Great was kind of playing politics when he rebuilt the temple and made it magnificent, almost as though he was wanting to say, don't you see, I'm actually like the Messiah. Please believe me. So this was the expectation, but it was surrounded with all kinds of other expectations, usually military. So usually it was by, through the leadership of the Messiah, the anointed one, that the rule went from Rome to Jewish people, and there would be therefore rule, and there would be a renewal of the kingdom. And of course, Jesus as Messiah, he's a very un-Messianic Messiah, as we saw last week. So, you know, what kind of king is he, and what kind of temple is he talking about? What was he really going to do? And those are two key themes that now flow through the following chapters in Mark's Gospel as he talks about Jesus' demise and then vindication. Now, Mark is telling the story of Jesus for his world. Yes, behind it we can see history, but he's telling the story for his world, and it's got the emphases that we recognize elsewhere as well. So one of them is to challenge believers, disciples of his own day, to see and to stay faithful. And you may remember we talked about the fact that he plays with the notion of seeing and not seeing. The disciples really didn't understand what Jesus was saying about being the Messiah. So the challenge is for the disciples to see. The disciples, the followers of Jesus in Mark's day, will have experienced the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. And that had to be processed. They had to think about it. So that's a key theme in Mark. What do we do as Jews, or as people who were converted to Judaism, or Gentiles, but with a very strong commitment to Judaism, to Israel's traditions? How do we cope with and how do we understand the destruction of the temple, which has just taken place? The picture there is of the Wailing Wall, the foundation actually of the platform, the huge platform, you know, a few football fields in size that Herod the Great created, on which he then rebuilt the temple as a magnificent building. In Mark's day, Christians, followers of Jesus, were being accused by Jews of blasphemy. And so it's not surprising that you've got the story of Jesus accused of blasphemy in the trial before the Jews. That's kind of tying up with Mark's world, the dangers that they faced. And similarly, believers in Mark's day were in danger from imperial authorities. So were you subversive? Are you dangerous? And so the trial of Jesus before Pilate would kind of be an echo for many of the people listening to Mark's Gospel of the dangers that they faced too from imperial authorities. So Mark's un-Messianic Messiah says in the climax of the passages that we looked at last week, in chapter 10, just before we get to the entry into Jerusalem in the last days. The Son of Man, talking about himself, came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. Really absurd. I mean, surely the Son of Man came to be served, didn't he? Didn't he come to win adherence? Didn't he come to win admiration? And sometimes in the church we, almost picture Jesus as bent on wanting people to admire him, to serve him. And he says, no, I didn't come to be served. I came to serve. I'm subverting that notion. That's what men who are in power want. They want to be served and glorified. I've not come for that. I've come to serve. And he did that in his ministry. And what's more, I'm giving my life. And it'll have a positive effect. It won't be a tragedy. It'll actually have a positive overflow effect, which he talks about here as like a ransom. It'll be redeeming. It'll be liberating for people. So his serving, of course, was expressed in Mark's Gospel through exorcisms, which we find rather strange. We understand mental illness differently, but it was all about setting people free from whatever powers oppressed them. And that could be individual, it could be in terms of community, it could be political as well. Lifting people out of poverty and oppression. That's what Jesus was doing in his ministry. And of course, why did he go to Jerusalem? Because he went to challenge the authorities. And that's what he did. He faced that danger and he knew that he was in trouble by doing so. But this is what it meant to say we want God's reign, and if you're saying that, you're really saying, no, we don't want Rome's reign. And that's a very dangerous kind of thing to say. His death was liberating, redeeming. His death wasn't a disaster, says Mark. No, it brought benefits. Mark doesn't say the main thing about Jesus was that he wanted to die, like a kind of generous suicide that would pay the penalty for people's sins and free God to forgive. I mean, that's an absurd notion. He doesn't talk like that at all, but he does say this was not a disaster. It was actually something really positive came out of it that continues the liberating work that I've been talking about in my ministry. Jesus talked about forgiveness already for all. John the Baptist talked about forgiveness already for all. His death then is seen as a symbol of God's generosity, also like a sacrifice covering the sins of all. It wasn't a disaster. And then what Mark goes on to say is that the resurrection was the vindication, like it was God saying yes when Pilate had said no. It really has a significant role, and we'll come back and talk about that a little bit later. So we're going to go through some of the early episodes, and one is the entry into Jerusalem. And it's very interesting the way Mark does this, because he has blind Bartimaeus in Jericho call out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Like Mark is playing with us. The blind Bartimaeus sees where the disciples did not. He does that earlier with also with the blind man at Bethsaida. The blind see, the disciples don't. That's part of Mark's play, confronting the disciples. And of course, we talked about lowliness. Well, lowly entry on a donkey. That's an image that you have in Zechariah. It happens to be of a king who's just won battles and killed lots of people, and now he's finished and he's coming into Jerusalem humbly on a donkey. That's not the picture of Jesus, but the humble part is. He's not really wanting to be adored. He's coming in with lowliness, consistent with his commitment to love. And there's a popular acclamation. We all know the story of Palm Sunday, and Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, was actually something that Jews said to people who were pilgrims coming to Jerusalem. It's from Psalm 118. So that was a standard thing to say to Jesus and to anyone else for that matter. And then it goes on to say, as Mark portrays it, blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. So that's where you've got the Messiah King theme coming through. Hosanna in the highest heaven. So the entry into Jerusalem. And it's interesting because it's a dramatic episode, and you wonder, where were the television cameras? Was it being, shown in Rome? How really was it? What was it like in history? What is the historical background of this? Almost certainly it was not the event like the Mardi Gras where everybody gathered together, the whole city stood still and all the cameras were running. No, it would have been, clearly Jesus would have entered Jerusalem. It's very likely that people praised him as he entered, but if they did anything too much and they did it for too long, you could be sure that the Roman authorities would come and squash it. So it's more realistic historically to think of it as not a huge event, but an event worth remembering. And it's interesting that as the story gets retold, we've got a separate version of it in John's Gospel where John, the author, we'll call him John, says, well, the disciples didn't actually understand what was happening at the time. Only later did they realize that, that was like celebrating Jesus as the Messiah. And Mark actually does it quite differently. So you get, John may reflect that earlier on it was an entry and people didn't make too much of it, not quite as much of it as Mark is making in the way he tells the story. Matthew has a very interesting take on it. Matthew often, when there's an allusion to an Old Testament text, he'll often quote it. And so the king comes in riding on a donkey on the foal of an ass. And what Matthew does is he says Jesus came riding on them, which is really very impossible. Like Matthew almost wants to have it really fulfill scripture, so he has Jesus riding on a donkey and its foal. It doesn't work. But that's that's one of the funny little things we have in the New Testament, and Matthew gives us that. There were resources, of course, for, we've had 40 years since Jesus' death and resurrection, since his ministry. So over those 40 years, the story's been told and retold, and it's been told and retold in the light of their faith. And so you have particular passages in the Old Testament that have helped to colour the narrative. Sometimes we have to think, okay, did the detail in the narrative come out of the Old Testament passage, or did something happen that reminded them of the Old Testament passage? For instance, we've already seen Zechariah 9:9, the king coming riding on a donkey. There's also language like the blood of the covenant, which Jesus uses or is portrayed as using in his last meal, talking about the blood of the covenant. There's also, and that's in chapter 9 of Zechariah, and then a little bit later when the disciples flee, again Mark quotes a bit out of Zechariah, strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. And it's really interesting that Matthew and others pick up more, the 20 pieces of silver, there are things like that that are there as well. And John's Gospel as well uses Zechariah, just those particular chapters. Psalm 118 I've referred to, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. We get that echoed in our Holy Communion service, don't we, in the great Thanksgiving prayer, where it really means not blessed are we coming in the name of the Lord, it means blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, namely Jesus. It's often misunderstood. But also in Psalm 118, there's reference to the stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner, the head cornerstone. That's out of Psalm 118 as well. So Mark uses, and maybe it had been used before Mark, uses passages from the Old Testament. Psalm 22 is perhaps the best known. And you find during the crucifixion of Jesus, you've got Jesus quoting Verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then you have a reference to the mockery, people wagging their heads and, saying, come down if you're the Messiah, come down from the cross. And then you have reference to dividing up his garments and casting lots for them. All of that comes out of Psalm 22. And I think it's likely that that detail comes out of Psalm 22 rather than that the events reminded people of Psalm 22. But with some of these things we can't know for certain. That's a nice Carol Wong sort of having a bit of a song with us there. So then we have the next big episode when Mark goes into chapter 11. Jesus has entered, and we have an interesting episode where initially he wants to get a fig off a fig tree, and it's actually the wrong season, as Mark says, so there wouldn't be one there, and he curses the fig tree like a little child. It's actually, if you take it literally, you'd say, my goodness, this is petulance, control yourself. But this is Mark's symbolism. It's highly symbolic. A fig tree was an image of Israel and its leaders. So the fig tree gets cursed. Then Jesus does something in the temple. Then at the other end, the fig tree, then they go out, they see it's all shriveled up. Now, Mark's hearers would know this is not about Jesus' behavior and when he hasn't got something to eat. This is highly symbolic about, it's kind of bookending the event that has been described of what Jesus did in the temple. What was he doing? Well, we often speak about the cleansing of the temple. I don't think that's appropriate at all. He's not trying to clean the temple. Reforming the temple, I don't think that's what Mark means at all. Jesus speaking against the building, I don't think that makes any sense at all. But when we look at the rest of Mark and we look at the fig tree and we look at some of the later passages, what Jesus did in overturning the tables and so forth, that was a symbolic act of confrontation like the prophets did in the Old Testament, indicating God's disapproval of the way the leaders of the temple, the spiritual leaders of Israel, had been operating. So it was a confrontation, and the fig tree either way, either side, kind of reflects that. It's a statement that Mark has Jesus portray, Mark portrays Jesus as acting against the temple, and has Jesus say, and again you see Old Testament passages get drawn into the narrative, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers or insurgents. People in Mark's day would have said, yeah, when the revolt took place against Rome, 66 to 70, before the destruction of the temple, some of the militants were hanging out in the temple. They would say, oh yes, we recognize that. But we see in it, of course, Mark's Gentile theme. Gentiles are included. And so my house should be called a house of prayer for all the nations, and you've not made it that. And it's to be a house of prayer. And what you find, what Mark does, is he portrays the community of the faithful as now constituting a new temple. So it's really quite clever the way it's all done. The new temple, it's not a building, it's a community of faithful people praying and being concerned. So that's quite a challenging kind of portrait that you have in Mark's Gospel. What about the history? Again, if this was a big television event and the crowd was hushed and there was Jesus in the middle and everybody was watching, it's not credible. The Romans had a tower that overlooked the outer court, and they would have jumped on Jesus straight away. But the fact is, the outer court of the temple was about 6 football fields in size, and there were thousands, some people say up to 100,000 people, pilgrims, were there for the Passover weekend. This was something that happened. It happened. I think historically it happened, but of course it didn't. It was over quickly enough that Jesus was able to disappear into the crowd. But again, it was an act of judgment, an act of confrontation of the temple authorities. And it's interesting that independently in John's Gospel, you've got reference to Jesus saying, destroy this temple and in 3 days or in a short time, I'll rebuild it. And independently in Mark's account of Jesus' trial, you've got this come up as well, the accusation that he said he was going to destroy the temple, which Mark says, no, he didn't. That's false. But what's true about it is that Jesus did say, in a short time, the temple's going to be destroyed. As an act of God's judgment, that's how it was interpreted by Mark. I think going back in history, Jesus almost certainly confronted the spiritual leaders of his day, and that's what the act was about. It's interesting, that's how chapter 11 is. It begins with the judgment on the temple. Chapter 13, and this is a block from 11 to 13, also talks about the judgment on the temple. It's going to be destroyed. And the temple theme goes right through into the Jewish trial, and it ends up being in the story of the cross, the crucifixion, where people, those who are mocking him say, well, you who would destroy the temple, come down from the cross. And then, of course, you remember that he dies and the curtain of the temple is torn in two. Again, that's highly symbolic, the judgment. It's confirming again God's judgment against the temple. So in between chapter 11 and chapter 13, or the beginning and end of them, is the vineyard parable, the parable of the vineyard, the tenants who really should have made available some grapes and wine to the owner and didn't, and killed the people who were sent. At the end of that, Mark has Jesus say, go and think about what this means. The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone, or the cornerstone. Now that's from a post-Easter, like after the event, reflection. Jesus is the cornerstone on which the new temple is built. The new temple is the community of believers. You see how that's how Mark is portraying it. And in between both of those references to the temple, there's also other conflicts which we won't go into about Jesus' authority, about whether you pay tax, about what the meaning of resurrection is, about the commandments, about whether calling Jesus Son of David is enough, and confrontation of, the example of the widow who had virtually nothing but gave it, and the leaders who had much and exploited the widows. So those things were there in these final chapters. And then, we're going to stop after this slide, but in chapter 13, Mark does something that people who are writing ancient biographies frequently did, and that is they composed a speech which they believe would be, this is what this hero would be saying to you now. Like it's a last testament or famous last words, and we see it in a number of places in the ancient world. It was a favorite thing to do if you were writing a biography that you wanted to have an impact with. You wanted to bring the impact of this famous person to bear. Deuteronomy is portrayed as the last words of Moses. Right? That's what it is. It's a putting together, this is his final word. And we have from the period, century or two before and after, we have many writings that are called testaments. So you have a testament of Abraham, what Abraham would have said. You have a testament to the 12 patriarchs, so all 12 sons of Jacob. And each of them, I mean, it's a fascinating piece of literature, and each of them kind of gives what they think that particular son of Jacob would be saying now to our generation. It was a favorite way of composing and a favourite way of writing up stories. Matthew, of course, does this. He takes Mark, just one chapter, and he adds another chapter. So Matthew 24, he adds Matthew 25, so it's a bigger slice. John's Gospel, of course, does the same. John's also been trained in the same kind of rhetorical school, so he's got a whole section that goes from chapter 13 right through to chapter 17 as Jesus' last words. And when you read them, they're actually not so much about the disciples in the day of Jesus. They are ways in which the author is saying, this is what I believe Jesus would be saying to us now, writing for his own generation. This is widely recognized. It was a technique that was used. It was often very helpful because the author would then summarize, this is the gist of what my hero was about. And Mark does that in chapter 13. So Mark's final speech of Jesus is in chapter 13. I mean, what they did was that they often would take something that would go back to the historical figure, but they'd extrapolate from it. And Mark extrapolates from it because Jesus would have said something about, God's judgment, or would have confronted the temple authorities. But Mark knows that the temple has been destroyed, so it all gets elaborated into a longer passage. The temple has been destroyed, and this was God's judgment. Mark has Jesus say, and then has advice being given in Mark 13. Be faithful when you face trials. And you will face trials in the synagogues. You'll be head up for blasphemy because of your big claims about Jesus. And you'll face dangers in the imperial courts. And this is why when Mark tells the story of Jesus in front of Jewish authorities and Jesus in front of imperial authorities, he's doing it with a view to, this is highly relevant for my people, because this is the danger that they face as well. And it ends with the statement that, don't worry, folks, the end is going to happen in our generation. Now, we know that's not true, that this was a kind of guess that was very widespread in the ancient world. Paul thought Jesus would come back during his lifetime, talked about the dead will be raised, and we who are left will be caught up to meet him in the air. And Mark, in a couple of places, portrays Jesus as saying that some of you standing here won't have died when the end of the world comes. And this generation will not pass away before all these things have happened and Jesus has returned. Now, okay, they didn't get everything right. They also believe the world is flat. It's okay, they are people of their time. But what Mark does, within that framework of thought, he says the important thing is to remain brave, to remain faithful, and to be a follower of what Jesus was on about. And of course we would want to say, yeah, there's nothing outdated about that. That's something that applies for us as well. We're going to have a pause, and it's an opportunity for any reflections and comments. I'm fading in and out a little bit on this, but are you hearing me all right? Yeah. Okay. So any comments or reflections on anything we've done up to this point? Don't hesitate.
Bill, can you, is this on?
It should be.
It is now.
Just now, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Bill, you used the word biography. It's like in a broad term, you mean, because it's not actually, we don't hear the stories of their lives, it's something else.
Yeah.
But that word biography is appropriate for what the writing is for Mark, or the Gospels. They're described as biography. That's a little bit confusing for me.
Yep, and you're right, it's not an adequate category. but it is what people did when they wrote biographies. I mean, if we're writing a biography, we'll want to write about childhood, formation, all those kind of things. When they wrote a life, they'd often call it the life of Apollonius, or the life of Julius Caesar, or the life of Herod the Great, or one of the other, Alexander the Great. What they did was that they would pick out significant episodes of that person's life and highlight them and highlight why they were important. And frequently what they would do, and the gospel writers really do very little of this, when Luke comes to write Acts, he does a lot of it, they would create speeches that the person would have given in certain occasions.
I remember you said that last time, yes.
Yeah. So
because I kept thinking it's Mark's biography, and so I wasn't quite getting it was Jesus' biography.
It's a biography of Jesus. It's
Yes.
It's not a very adequate category, and so we tend not to say biography but gospel, because it's not actually just trying to give us a picture of history. It's wanting to give us gospel, like it's wanting to give us good news. So they told the stories and put them together in order to bring the impact of Jesus to their generation who were listening. So that's what they are.
Sorry, I see that as like they were trying to put words on paper to describe the phenomena that they've held on to. Well, Mark held on for 40 years, and he's trying to express it on paper.
Yeah,
which is incredible difficulty, of course, but
really difficult to do, and people were trained to do this. If you studied rhetoric, and people like Mark would have had to study rhetoric. Like rhetoric is how you write so that something can be presented orally to a group. And as I said right at the beginning, that was the normal way. You didn't sit down and read something. Somebody read it to you, and so you developed all kinds of techniques. You learn how to begin and end an episode in the same way, like with the fig tree episode, so you know that's a paragraph. Like if we were printing it, we'd simply leave a line or leave some spaces. So, and they would, little tricks they use, like we'll see later that Mark's very fond of threes, so he often has three things together. Put them, So it is, in that sense, creative writing, but it's creative writing constrained by or obedient to the traditions that have been passed down over 40 years of very active church life that go back to Jesus. I mean, yes, of course, some of the stories you can see have been reshaped and, moulded so that they'd have an impact, but behind them, most of them, is material that goes right back to Jesus. So it means that when we look at Mark and we want to say, what can we say historically, we have to respect the fact that we're dealing with a creative writing. But it's a creative writing in which is embedded some really interesting history, and you get to learn what's likely to have been an embellishment and what's likely to go right back to Jesus. One of the things that helps us with that is we know how Matthew and Luke used Mark and revised Mark, including changing the order of things, correcting the grammar, making it smooth, adding a few extra sayings in. That's the kind of thing that you can, that's what the historical reconstruction thing is about. Yeah, it's a challenge. But thank you for the question, because it's a really important issue. Is it all right? All right. Okay. Okay, that's fine.
I'd give thanks for that in this generation, but not actually coming in that generation bit of Mark's gospel, because without that urgency and that zeal, and some of you might even be there, that sense of being brave, one wonders how the church would have grown and spread without that sort of proclamation and that sort of need. If you're just saying, if it didn't have that, Mark, the Gospel of Mark probably wouldn't have been told the way it was and people gone out and doing it because they thought it was about to happen. So we give a lot of flack to that in a lot of times, but sometimes we forget to look at it and give thanks for the energy that created in the church we're living in, and we're still called to that, yes. But if they weren't called to it in that very moment, right at the very beginning, with that impetus, one wonders what would have happened.
Yeah. I think the other thing to remember is that it wasn't central. Like if it had been the centre of their faith, the faith would have collapsed. It proved not to be true. But the centre of their faith was a relationship. And that was the key thing. And we hold on to that. So our faith doesn't fall apart because we no longer believe the world's flat. And our faith doesn't fall apart because we no longer can't believe that, the end of the world's about to take place in the year 70 CE. Yeah, that's okay. And our world doesn't fall apart because we're no longer believing in demons in the way they did. But what we hold on to, of course, is the liberation and the love and the vision. Yeah. Any other comments or questions? All right. Well, we will move on and what we find is that Mark now begins to talk about the serious end of things, and he's always got an eye to his listeners, like the people who are going to listen to his gospel, because they too are facing trials and difficulties. And it's really interesting, this is really interesting, that Mark makes women the best models of faith. Yeah? In chapter 14 at the beginning, it's the woman who anoints Jesus' feet, and the men get all upset about it. It's almost funny, but it's a bit dicey. What's this guy, what's Jesus doing, letting this woman with a massage oil, which normally a prostitute might have, what's Jesus doing letting this woman come and anoint his head? This is really, you better not even have anything to do with women like that. And Jesus, of course, said, no, look, forget it. It's okay. She's allowed to show affection in her own particular way. And so Mark, that's very interesting. In the composition is really important when you're writing a long document. So Mark has the woman as the model of faith at the beginning. And who are the followers of Jesus at the end when he dies under the cross? The women. Now, was Mark a feminist? Well, not in our terms, but was Mark sensitive to inclusion of women? Absolutely. Like, this is played off against the men because the model for the men is that they are, amongst the men, there's one who betrays, there's one who denies, like Judas betrays, Peter, the leading man, denies, and the rest flee. Now, this is quite extraordinary, isn't it? The men flop, the women are faithful. That's really quite significant that we need to hear. And Jesus himself, of course, models love. And his last meal, what he's really doing, and it becomes Holy Communion for us, of course, is really saying, look, this is me, I'm giving myself to you, I've given myself to you, like bread, like spilt wine poured out. That's me. That's what I'm going to give myself right through to death. And I've been doing it all the way. And this is a new way of looking at relationship with God. I mean, Jesus models discipleship in that sense. And then, of course, at the end of that little episode where he's with the disciples sharing himself in that dramatic way, he says, "Truly, I tell you, I'll never again drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." Jesus always kept the vision of the kingdom of God as a feast in his teaching in a prominent place. Like, if you ask Jesus for one of his favourite ways of thinking about hope, he would say, "I think about hope as a big feast, a meal, where there's actually room for everybody and nobody's going to be excluded." I mean, it doesn't make sense for us because we have significant meals every week, every day. You know, meals are not significant for us, really. But for the ancient world, where people were living often on the edge of poverty, the significant meals were when you went up to Jerusalem with a sacrifice and you got some of the meat, the priests left over, and you had a big feast. Or there was a wedding and you had a few days of feasting. They were highlights, and that's why people like Jesus take the image of a feast and say, this is a way of thinking about your dream for humanity. And so Jesus does that. We often lose that with Holy Communion if it becomes too ceremonialized. Really, when we do this, we are participating in a foretaste. We're really saying, I also share that vision and I'm going to feed on it because I want my life to be a life that's good news for the poor. I want my life to be something that brings change and love in our world. It's really challenging. And Jesus also models in Mark what it means to be tested in your faith and broken. And in the Gethsemane story, he comes back and says to the disciples, just watch, keep awake, stay awake for goodness sake. You know, and that's of course a message for the people of Mark's day, as it's a message for any day. A bit difficult portraying Jesus as human as that. So John's Gospel is really slightly embarrassed and has rewords it and has Jesus say, well, you know, I could pray, save me from this hour, but I'm not going to do that because I've come to do this. But Mark and Luke portray Jesus very much as under stress, because that's what it's like for Mark's hearers as well. We come to the Jewish trial, and this is really interesting because there are two main charges, as you would expect. One about the temple and one about being the Messiah. Those are the two themes that flow through these chapters. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that's made with hands, and in 3 days I'll build another not made with hands. Now this has been played with. It's been played with. Not made with hands is already hinting that it's false, but it's true. The community of faith of prayer, not made with hands, human people, they are actually the new temple. No, he didn't say, I will destroy, but he did predict that destruction will come. Do I need to swap over? I think I do, because I'm fading a little bit. It's on, okay. So that's the first accusation that's brought before Jesus at the trial. And then the next one is, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? Are you the Messiah? You know, that question. And Jesus, of course, says, yes, I am, but. And he talks about himself as the Son of Man. The way The way, now. The way it then goes on is that Mark says, or has the group say, this is blasphemy. There are some difficulties with this because there was nothing blasphemous about claiming to be the Messiah or having other people claim to be the Messiah, God's Son, in that sense. There were plenty of people at the time, there were quite a few who also claimed to be the Messiah, and you don't hear them accused of blasphemy. So something's going on here, and Luke is aware of the problem, and so he divides the question up from, are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of the Blessed? Because are you the Son of the Blessed could be understood in a way that a person is claiming to be God's child, God's son, like a god. So that was how it was being often understood by Jews in Mark's time. And so Mark portrays it as blasphemy, and Luke is sensitive to that and changes it. There's a few other little things that cause us to wonder whether the Jewish trial in Mark is actually historical. It's a problem that it is held at night. This was contrary to basic Jewish law. You don't hold trials in darkness. Actually, in history, this is the case. Normally, you never hold a trial in darkness, right down through the centuries, right through to our own time. So what Luke does is he retells the story, he relocates the trial to the morning time. So that's interesting. But even more interesting, John's Gospel, which in many ways is much more highly creative in the speeches of Jesus than the other Gospels, has some valuable historical material in it when it comes to details and data. And one of them is that, no, there was not a trial. There was simply a hearing among the high priests. Now, history is a matter of degrees of probability. We have to say sometimes we don't really know. My own view is that John is probably right, and that what we've got in Mark has been created out of traditions in the light of the fact that people of his day were facing the accusation of saying blasphemous things when they talked about Jesus. He may be right. There are some things we don't quite know, but it certainly would fit, and it may well be modelled on Mark's day. Interrupt me at any point or raise a question at any point. There are historical questions. There are some discrepancies in the stories, but underneath the stories there is a historical base, and sometimes we aren't quite sure which of the versions is the more historical. In this case, I think it's probably more likely to be John, but no one can say that for sure. The Roman trial, it's interesting that the Roman trial doesn't have any mention of the temple theme, but it does have the accusation of King of the Jews, which is just another way of saying Messiah, Christ, Son of God, Son of David, King. Like this popular notion of a Messiah to come who will rule instead of the Romans, if you like, usually on the basis of military success. But there were some, and Jesus is one of them, who saw this happening in a different kind of way and hoped for it. It's very clear that Pilate put Jesus into the category of being a subversive. It's also clear that he did not see him as a militant. Otherwise, he would have rounded up the disciples. Yeah? Jesus was a Messiah of word, not of the sword. That was his power and his strength. But Pilate was not stupid. Pilate knew that there was a problem. If you have somebody like this going around saying, God's reign, God's empire is going to be established, because it inevitably is a contradiction of Roman Empire. And if you start raising hopes for people, you are going to cause instability. So you get Barabbas offered as a swap for Jesus. Why? Because he's in the same category. Now, Barabbas was a rebel by force of arms. Jesus was a rebel not by force of arms. And either side of Jesus, they crucified not thieves, people who stole money or something. The term leistai is a term used for insurgents, rebels. So Jesus was crucified between two rebels. Why? Because that's the category he fell into as far as Pilate was concerned. And it's not as though this was the only event in the first century where Rome had to get rid of a would-be revolutionary. It did it all the time. There were often crosses with people hanging on them and dogs dragging the bones out of their feet and birds picking out their eyes. They were a deterrent. Don't mess with Rome. With your ideas or with your guns. No guns, of course, but with your swords. And so the mockery probably is also historical, and of course it fits well in what Mark is saying. They ridiculed him by putting a crown of thorns on his head and putting a scepter in his hand, and said, "Hail, King of the Jews." We know that this kind of ridiculing, abuse of prisoners was very widespread. So it's not atypical that that kind of thing might have happened. So going back to the history, and I've made some comments about this already, Pilate's assumption is that this was a non-military subversive movement. And the best thing to do, especially when you've got a huge crowd at the Passover, and there were often disturbances at the Passover. One of the things that the Roman Empire was very sensitive about its eastern flank. So their interest was security and stability. They don't want populist leaders. You just want things to stay as they are. And so one of the ways you discourage is by crucifying. I've got a question about Barabbas, because it's an Aramaic word meaning the son of the father, which raises the suspicion that it may be an invention on Mark's part. It may not be, but again, we can't really know. It's a kind of that's a bit sus, but it may not be. But certainly there's no reason to doubt his being killed between two rebels and being treated as in that category, and having the accusation King of the Jews over him. A would-be Messiah like some of the others we've killed before and will kill later. When it comes to the crucifixion, as I mentioned, Psalm 22 plays a role. They divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. Yes, that's there in the psalm, and that's what Mark quotes, alludes to. That detail quite possibly is what creates the narrative, rather than the narrative reminding them of what's in Psalm 22. All who see me mock at me, they make mouths at me, they shake their heads. Commit your cause to the Lord. Let him deliver, let him rescue the one in whom he delights. Again, this fitted the ridicule, by the way, 3 lots of ridicule, that's typical of Mark, that happen underneath the cross. The details may well be brought into the narrative to fill it out. Maybe people didn't know much about what actually happened, but they read the last hours of Jesus in the light of what was in the Psalms. And then, of course, to have Jesus say, my God, why have you forsaken me? Did he say that? Or did Mark have him say that? The other gospel writers sometimes change it and have him say other things. It's quite possible that Jesus said that. It's quite possible that he didn't. We don't really know. But that it was a disaster, like a terrible, shaming, ridiculing, awful event that we can scarcely imagine, that was history. They squashed, they bloodied Jesus. That's what you did. If you didn't do that, people might imitate him, and he might have more followers. Mark, as I said, has lots of sets of three. The temple accusation is in the Jewish trial. We saw it there. It's in the mockery, you who would, destroy the temple, come down. And then it's in the tearing of the curtain, which again is probably a symbolic act, but certainly in Mark's narrative, continuing the theme of God's judgment against the spiritual leaders. Mark's 3 thing comes through in 9 a.m. they crucify him, 12 noon, 3 p.m. Like it's sets of threes. That's just Mark's way of doing things. There are historical issues that don't affect our faith, but was the Friday Passover day, or was the Saturday Passover day? Well, John says Saturday was Passover day, and Jesus died the day before, at the time when the lambs were being killed, slaughtered, for the lamb dinner that you have on Passover night that starts at 6 o'clock on the Thursday night. Well, So the Passover day is on Saturday for John. The Passover day is on Friday for Mark. Friday was the day Jesus died, but there's a discrepancy. And really, we don't know the answer, who's right. That sometimes happens. There have been fundamentalist people who try to explain it away and say, oh, well, maybe the calendar was different. No, I mean, it's just a normal kind of thing that you'd have discrepancies like that as stories are passed on through the Eastern Mediterranean over a long period of time. It's not a big issue, but it's an interesting issue in terms of reconstructing history. And then, as if we're entering into one of Dickens's stories where something dour is going to happen and the sky turns dark and the rain comes, darkness, when it was noon, darkness came over the whole earth until 3 in the afternoon. Highly symbolic. It's almost certainly highly symbolic narrative. They did this in the ancient world. And Matthew sort of adds earthquakes, this is what they did, that they were painters, those of you who are artists. You don't try to reproduce a photograph. Yes, you've got the key details there, but you're going to have colours and movement and, suggestive things around the side, and that's exactly what Mark and other storytellers had as they told what goes back to real history. Son of God, you are my beloved Son, at Jesus' baptism. Transfiguration, this is my beloved Son, listen to him. This is a set of 3 that comes to a climax when a centurion, a Gentile, says, truly this was the Son of God. Now Mark is being quite subversive here, like he's got a blooming Gentile, not a Jew, as the hero of faith at the end. Now remember, Mark's got this Gentile inclusivity of Gentiles, a theme running through Mark, and it reaches its climax at this point in the crucifixion story.
And he's really, Bill, Josh here, he's really laid the onion there too. Like you've got in between baptism, and then you've gone between the prophets, and then finally, so it's gradual. He's stepping you into that.
Yeah.
It's really clever in the threes.
Yeah.
Mm.
So there is a cleverness in Mark and composition, but when we say that, we're also saying, yes, that he's being clever with material that also goes back to history. So there are historical things about all of this. Crucifixion was a Roman method of executing people, a deliberately cruel exposure so that it would be a deterrent. We sometimes hear people say, and every time Easter comes round, the Easter period, we'll have people talk about the Jews killed Jesus. No, they didn't. Like, there was probably some collusion between the leadership and the Roman authorities. All of that's a bit debatable, but it was Pilate who killed Jesus. It's a Roman method of execution. And it's part of Rome's security agenda. You've got to keep things stable on the eastern flank of the empire. Jesus is accused of being king of the Jews. They all knew what this meant. This meant subversion. Okay, he's not got any swords, but he's got words, and that's just as dangerous and destabilizing. There is a detail about Simon of Cyrene, who's the father of a couple of people who are named in Mark's story. It may well be that little bit is historical. Otherwise, the reference to his kids wouldn't make a lot of sense. Any questions or thoughts or reflections on what we've done in this kind of key part of Mark's story, the awful story of Jesus' execution? I think what we'll do is stand up. Let's stand up. I think it's a good idea to do that.
I also think about, at the beginning of this block, talking about the women, and that just wasn't done. So that tells me that it's pretty striking that that really is something you really, like, I look at that and think that's probably one of the most true things we can hold on to, because it is so revolutionary in its context. And the other Gospels give mention to women lots too. So I just think, isn't that amazing? The word feminism, of course, didn't exist back then either. So I find that really powerful. It's 51% of the population, for goodness sake.
Yeah, the seeds are there in a context in which women were treated as inferior. The seeds were there to have a major revolution about attitudes towards women, and they didn't. So churches then developed into male-centred, priest-driven institutions, and women were quietly suppressed. The best thing a woman could do would be to be a Mary and sit at Jesus' feet and with her sister Martha help to serve the men. But there were subversive elements, and once you started saying that a woman is a person of worth, you really are sowing the seeds for change. It's just took 2,000 years, that's all, and we're still trying.
Still working on it. Sorry, Bill, I have a question.
No sorries.
So with Mark, 40 years later, writing secretly, I presume, because Rome was still flourishing. Can you tell me what impact Christianity then had, that they were so feared that they did that to Jesus? Did the faith that followed bring Rome undone?
Bring?
Rome undone.
Not really. I mean, they didn't have churches. You know, they met in people's houses. And sometimes that would be quite secret. Sometimes that would be quite secretive. So, it was possible to have privacy. And they didn't have cameras, in the streets or anything like that. So a lot of things happened. Like synagogues, you had Jews meeting. So those kind of things happened. One of the things that happened over time was that the Christian faith tended to shape itself into a set of beliefs which were concerned about the world to come rather than this world, and the concern to say to the authorities, we are not bad people, we are good citizens. So by the time you get to say First Peter and James and some of those later writings, that's the kind of focus. And of course then later, as Christianity grew and then Constantine becomes a convert, then Christianity becomes the chaplain to the powers that be. Now that's a bit of simplistic.
Hundreds of years later.
200 or 300 years later. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to generalise too much about that. And I don't think it's helpful to say it all went wrong. No, it didn't. There were faithful people. But it was enormously difficult. It might have been all very well for Jesus and his movement. Jesus. Oh. No, dying. Here we go. We're back. We're back. Is it me holding it at the bottom? That's all right. Okay. I can't remember what I was going to say, but
it was very difficult for Christianity to.
Yeah, you could have a dream when you're out in the wilderness of Judea that things are going to change and we're going to bring Palestine back to Israel, and the reign of God will happen. Go out into the wider world. People in Corinth are not really interested in a Jewish Messiah. Why should we? So Messiah, Christ, becomes a kind of surname. And then what is it that you actually value in Jesus? And we see a variety of approaches. And some of them are, what we value in Jesus is that he did something that will help us to escape our mortal bodies and go into the world to come. But there were other groups who said, actually he also taught us about love. So there's a mixture of things, yeah. But, it is fair to say that the church's gospel, even up until my childhood to some degree, there was a very strong focus on the main thing is going to heaven, when you die, not going to hell. And that actually doesn't capture what Jesus was on about adequately.
The temple.
Yeah. So the image of the temple is wonderful because that means, the temple is to be a place of prayer for all peoples. And that's what the church is called to be, a place where we pray and a place where we celebrate love and hope. Another question, or shall we? We're going to move on to resurrection. Easter, and we go home. Mark's Easter story is interesting because it begins with the women who were still hanging around, hadn't fled. And then there's a group of them, a small group of them, who, along with a daring Joseph of Arimathea, who was in the establishment and managed to get hold of the body of Jesus and put it in a tomb. And the women were ready to do the normal things that you do to a body. You wrapped it up and you put spices on it so it didn't stink so much. That's what you normally did. Then they go to the tomb, according to Mark's story, and this is really, really strange. 8 verses only, at the end of Mark's Gospel, deal with the Easter story, and that's it. And there's a young man in the tomb, Doesn't say an angel. And this is interesting too, because sometimes artists, paint themselves into a portrait or into a scene. And it's quite possible that Mark's painting himself into the scene here. But anyway, what he says is, he has been raised, Jesus has been raised, he's not here. Go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see him just as he told you. Now that's the instructions that the young man gives to the women. But the women said nothing to anybody because they were scared. That's the end of the gospel. What on earth is going on? What is Mark doing? Why didn't it just fizzle? Because the women didn't say anything. They didn't speak to the disciples. The other Gospels say that they did, but not Mark. He's the early one. He said no, said nothing. So why did Mark do this? There are basically two stories. The story of the women who find the tomb empty. Now later, they actually meet Jesus and all kinds of things, and there are angels and so forth, but Mark doesn't say that. Just says they find the tomb empty, and there's a young man who tells them what Peter and co should do, and they don't tell them. But then you've got a story about Peter and co in Galilee, to whom Jesus appears. The earliest tradition we have comes in Paul, who says Jesus was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, and then to the 12. So the start from Paul's belief in the resurrection of Jesus is an appearance of Jesus to Peter in Galilee. And it's interesting, we've got Mark alluding to that there's going to be an appearance to Peter in Galilee. And you've got Luke also independently having the disciples say to the men who are on the road to Emmaus and who join the disciples, they say, the Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon, to Peter. So very clearly, one of the, if not the earliest tradition that set it all off is this belief that Jesus appeared to Peter in Galilee. But you've got the other story as well. Mark must assume that they later meet. And as I mentioned, the other Gospels change the stories so that at the tomb Jesus does appear to the women, and the women do go and tell the disciples, and the disciples are in Jerusalem. So there's actually a lot of difference around these stories. But Mark knows that Peter's encounter was first, it was the foundation. History. There's a common element amid the great variety, and there is quite a lot of variety, and if you're interested in contradictions, you'll find plenty of them. But underneath them all is the faith that God has raised Jesus from the dead, and the foundational thing about that is that he appeared to Peter. Resurrection proved by Jesus appearing to Peter. Is the tomb story a story that was developed because it would have to be so? There must have been an empty tomb? That's possible. It may well have been so, because in their belief, resurrection was not a resurrection body replacing your body, but your body being transfigured into a different state. So there wouldn't be any remainder on earth. That was their understanding. There had to be an empty tomb. But Jesus was not resuscitated wandering around Jerusalem, needing somewhere to sleep and eat and all that kind of thing. He was materializing and dematerializing because that's the nature of resurrection bodies. They're not physical. Paul says they're spiritual. The transfiguration is a kind of foretaste of what a resurrection body looks like. It's a shining thing. It's like a star. Daniel says something like that. So you find Jesus, the stories tell of Jesus disappearing and appearing and going through closed doors, and a lot of this is fantasy and imagination, but behind it all is a faith. No, God has said yes to Jesus, and that was the faith they held on to. And what they believed was that this was not only Jesus' resurrection, but the first of resurrections to come. That fitted their belief that they were at the end of time. And so they expected the end of time very soon. Jesus would come back and others would be raised from the dead. It would be soon to come. It didn't happen like that. They all went to Jerusalem because that's where they expected it would happen. But the key thing was that they experienced this as vindication. God has said yes to Jesus. And however you take it, the resurrection story, the Easter story, with all its variations, has as its core theme the belief that Jesus was not abandoned, but God raised him from the dead. That's to say, God took him to himself, God vindicated him, and that helped them also to look back on Jesus' life and his death and say, no, it wasn't a disaster after all. There's a couple of slides and then I'll stop and we'll have some questions. So it helped them to come to terms with Jesus' death. On the one hand, he was a victim of Rome's security priorities. We can understand that historically, it makes sense. It was an accident of Rome's desire to keep things calm. The resurrection was understood by the first believers, the disciples, as a vindication. Jesus died the way the prophets sometimes were persecuted and were killed. They didn't start believing in resurrection because of Jesus' resurrection. They believed in resurrection already. So if you sing songs and things as though the meaning of Easter is that now we can believe in resurrection, they all believed. Jews believed in resurrection. Only the Sadducees didn't. The important thing was that Jesus was resurrected already, and that was a sign of God's saying yes. And of course, he suffered. So they needed to come to terms with, okay, he's been vindicated, but why did he have to go through that? Well, the righteous in the Psalms went through things like that. And so they began to tell the story of Jesus using the Psalms, as we've seen Psalm 22 in particular. But they also began to say, well, we talk about the heroes of the Maccabean era when they rose up against the Syrians at the beginning of the 2nd century. And when they died, they said their death was like it was like an unleashed benefit for all of us. And then they began to say, well, like a sacrifice does. Their view of a sacrifice was that it actually did something, like it unleashed something. And so they began also to say, well, Jesus' death, awful death, was not a disaster. It was actually, well, it was, but it also produced something, like positive. He died for us, for our benefit. And they used all kinds of imagery to talk about it. He's like a ransom. He's, there's all kinds of imagery, sacrificial imagery. It doesn't all fit well together. But it's quite dangerous because some people then take it and turn it into a kind of a dogma, so that you get people almost talking as though God really doesn't love and doesn't want to forgive people, but Jesus persuaded him by working out what the punishment had to be for people who had sinned and saying, I'll take the punishment and now I'll persuade God to be a bit kind. It's not normally what God is. That, of course, is a nonsense, but we will sometimes find that reflected in our traditions. So then and now, in Mark's world, the old temple is now being replaced by us, the new temple, Mark is saying. Quite daring. I think Matthew and Luke aren't quite so happy with that, so they change it, but Mark's happy to say that. You need to be alert to the trials and dangers, Mark's saying, because they were in danger. Hope the end is near. Be faithful to the vision. The Colosseum, that you can see on the screen, was built by Jewish slaves who were taken to Rome after the destruction of the temple. So the destruction of the temple is kind of celebrated by Rome's wonderful Colosseum. Yeah, and if and we don't know where Mark was writing, but if he's in Rome, that would kind of run shivers down your spine. Our world, of course, we don't crucify, but we have ways of killing hope for change. We are still good at killing love. We are still good at maintaining the status quo. We are still good at not being good news for the poor. We are still good at, in our sophisticated ways, undermining justice and fairness. And so if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, Mark would be tapping us on the shoulder and say, look, be alert, be alert. If you're going to be a follower of Jesus, you need to love people. Don't be naive. You've got to also think about structures of community. You've got to care about those things as well. Being a community of faith and prayer is still what it's about for us. Now we've got just a little bit of time, not a lot of time, but there may be some questions or comments and we'll have a conversation. Anyone still awake to ask a question or make a comment? Oh yes, the last little line I had is, the challenge is to embrace love and hope. Despite the resistance we will always find. And I've got a book coming out called Following Mark, interestingly enough. It's not yet out, but it'll be out by the end of the month, I think. Any comments or questions on what we've looked at in the last few slides? Yeah.
That lady that poured oil on his head, was that the same lady that the apostles tried to get rid of her, tried to hunt her away one time? Was that her? Is that the same lady? Or?
Yeah. Well, yes, it's interesting. There are different stories that probably go back to the same event. And the stories are interesting because they also include all kinds of explanations that would justify Jesus responding positively to her. One of the Luke actually locates it not at the last days of Jesus, but in Luke 7, early on in his ministry. He may even be right. It seems to be an independent tradition. But he's then turned her into a sinner who has repented and is coming to say, thank you for having my sins forgiven. That's not the way Mark portrays it. In Mark, it's everyone who's present complains about her. In Matthew, it's the disciples who complain. Guess who complains in John's Gospel? Judas. Isn't that interesting? But John's Gospels reshape the story so that, in fact, it's Mary of Mary and Martha fame. So she's actually anointing Jesus' feet. Luke has the woman anoint Jesus' feet as well. So feet or head. You know, you can see this is a story that's been told and retold and reshaped It's a bit more respectable if it's Mary of Mary and Martha in their house and she's just doing that as an act of affection. But I think originally it's probably a story of a woman who spontaneously responded to Jesus, and the men were really unhappy about it, and Jesus was not prepared to push her away. Yeah. As a man should have done.
I'm just wondering, this is meant for oratory. In what context was that done? Who orated Mark's Gospel?
Yeah, so they would be meeting in houses. They didn't really have churches for another couple of centuries. So they had the tradition of reading the Old Testament scriptures. And then they would, once they had a gospel like the Gospel of Mark, they would also read bits of or large sections of Mark. So it was done in the community. Very similar to what people would do in synagogue gatherings, like not in a synagogue, but in a Jewish group meeting is called a synagogue. Synagogue later is used for a building, but when Jews got together, they would do that. They would pray, they would read from the scriptures. And what early Christians did was that they would say, we're reading from the scriptures and we're reading the story of Jesus. Yeah. Well, I think we really should call it an evening. I normally go along this line that you should never run sessions that go over time. When I was training as a youth worker, this is one of the things that was drilled into us. Finish at least 5 minutes early, and people will have a good feeling and they'll come again. But this is the end of the session. And it's after 9 o'clock. Can't dare you to come again. And next week we'll be going to WA, to Perth, and I'll be doing some presentations there on some different things. Anyway, it's been good to have you with us, and for those who are watching on YouTube, read Mark and enjoy Mark, and let Mark challenge you.
I think just on behalf of people that I've come to all of these, just thank you for your you-ness and your dedication to good scholarship and a life of learning and nuance and picking things apart and letting us ask you questions, and you being very kind in your response and really giving us all of your loving God with your mind as part of your whole. And just thank you so much, Bill. You're a real gift to us, and I'm super looking forward till next year to try and put pressure on you to do something again, because it's just amazing. Thank you.